Sand covered everything. It didn't fall like rain. It slithered, crept, scraped its way into corners like a living thing. When the storm swept through the village of Al-Kamar, the sun vanished as if swallowed by something older than the sky itself. The world didn't turn black. It turned the dull, heavy yellow of closed eyelids. Every sound was muffled, as if spoken through a mouth full of dust. Yara clutched her shawl tightly around her face, standing in the doorway of her clay brick home, staring toward the vast haze of the desert where her father had walked off at dawn to find a lost camel that never came back. The wind howled like a woman mourning her wedding night. Grains of sand slipped into every crack of the walls, the roof, and memory itself. By the time the sun returned the next morning, only one thing was certain. He was not coming back. The villagers came without knocking. They didn't offer condolences. They didn't say, "I'm sorry," or wrap her in warm embraces like people in the books she used to read as a child. They simply brought her a clay jar, empty, unsigned, unsealed, and placed it silently in the center of her home. "You must whisper," said old Uqba, the village grief-keeper, her spine bent like the handle of a worn water jug. "1 jar per death. No tears, no screams, just breath, just grief, whispered." Yara stared at the jar. It looked so ordinary, just another piece of pottery. But inside, it was meant to hold something dangerous, sorrow. Sorrow that could grow teeth if left loose. Sorrow that needed to be sealed and buried before it turned into something else. "No," she said. Her voice was dry, cracked with sand. "I have nothing to say. He left me." No one argued. No one tried to comfort her. They only looked at her with quiet dread, as if she'd just invited a sandstorm to live in her bones. Then, one by one, they left, leaving behind the jar, empty, waiting, heavy with silence. That night, the wind had gone, but the floor groaned. It was a low sound, soft as breath, a creak, a sigh, from deep beneath the wood. Yara opened her eyes in the dark, heart quickening, the hairs on her arms standing up. It sounded like someone lying beneath the floorboards. She listened. Nothing, except the uneven thump of her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes again, but the breathing remained. Slow, steady, as if someone were crying without making a sound. A father who never heard goodbye, a daughter who refused to mourn, and a jar still waiting to be filled. The jar sat on the shelf like a watching eye. Yara had moved it once, only once. She tried to tuck it away behind a sack of lentils, hoping to forget its presence. But by the next morning, it had somehow found its way back to the center of the room. She told herself she must have moved it in her sleep. She told herself a lot of things lately. 3 days passed. The villagers returned, not with food or company, but with glances, suspicious ones, hollow ones, eyes that lingered too long on her windows, feet that shuffled nervously when passing her door. She had become a shadow too heavy to greet. No one said it aloud, but she could feel it in the dry air between them. She hadn't whispered. She hadn't sealed the sorrow. She hadn't buried it. And in Al-Kamar, that was a dangerous thing. Inside her home, silence grew thick. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that clings to the walls and hums behind your ears. The kind that makes every breath feel like an intrusion. She avoided the jar. She swept around it. She cooked with her back to it. But each night, just before sleep, her eyes would drift toward it involuntarily, drawn to its stillness, to its emptiness. It felt hungry. That night, the house wept. It began with a slow drip from the ceiling, a drop of amber that landed on the dirt floor with a soft pluck. Yara lit a lantern and raised it toward the roof. Her eyes widened. Wax. Thick, golden wax. It bled from the joints where ceiling met wall, slow and deliberate, like something sweating out poison. More drops followed, trailing along the seams, curling down the edges like tears sliding from unseen eyes. She touched it with one finger. Warm, sticky, fragrant, like smoke and honey and something old. The jar hadn't moved, but it looked fuller. Not in weight or size, but presence, as if it had started listening. That night, Yara sat in the corner of the room, arms wrapped around her knees, unable to sleep. Every creak of the floor seemed louder. Every gust of wind outside sounded like a voice just out of reach. Her father had always spoken softly, so softly she sometimes had to lean in to hear him. The way he said her name, Yara, like a secret only they shared. But now that softness felt different. Now it felt muffled, as if pressing through layers of earth, as if he was calling her name from underneath her feet. She stared at the jar, unsealed, untouched, and began to wonder, what happens to grief when no one listens to it? In the village of Al-Kamar, silence is sacred, but silence left too long begins to echo.
At first, it was only at night. A low groan beneath the floorboards, a soft sigh, a subtle stretch of old wood. But soon, it became rhythmic. Not random creaks, but breathing, shallow, steady, measured, like someone lying flat under the house, chest rising and falling in perfect time with hers. Yara tried not to hear it. She stuffed rags into her ears. She lit incense and whispered prayers she barely remembered. She even opened the windows and shouted into the wind, just to make a sound louder than the one growing inside her home. But the floor did not stop. If anything, it listened. By the fourth night, something changed. The breath became wet. Not dripping, not spilling, but heavy, as though lungs beneath the floor were filling with something that wasn't air. She placed her ear to the wooden planks and heard it. A sob. One single broken sob. Low, choked, like a voice that had swallowed too much silence and was finally trying to spit it out. She stumbled back, heart pounding, mouth dry. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But deep in her marrow she knew that voice was her father's. It wasn't calling her, not yet. It wasn't angry, not yet. It was only crying. Crying for something that hadn't been buried. The next morning, Yara stood barefoot on the floor and whispered to the boards, "You're not real." The wood was cool, still, but as she turned away, she heard it. A single whisper, almost gentle. "Then why are you shaking?" She froze. Her legs were trembling, her chest was tight, her body betrayed the very logic she clung to. That afternoon, she returned to the shelf. The mourning jar still sat untouched. She picked it up, hands shaking. It felt warmer, almost pulsing. She gripped it tighter and turned it upside down. Nothing. No cracks, no wax. But as she lowered it again, she heard a sound from inside. Not sloshing, not rattling. A breath. Short, barely audible, but there. As if the jar had started inhaling. That night, she slept outside. The stars above offered no comfort, only questions. What if the jar was feeding on her silence? What if the thing breathing beneath the floor was not her father, but the grief she refused to feel? What if it had grown too large to fit inside a vessel now? There are spirits that haunt houses, and then there are feelings that haunt bones. Grief left untended becomes both. It began with the corners, tiny glistening beads forming where wall met ceiling, amber, translucent, slow-moving, like tears unwilling to fall. By mid-morning, the wax was everywhere. It crept downward in uneven trails, thin at first, then thicker, more deliberate. It clung to the mud walls of the house as though the structure itself was bleeding sadness. Yara stood in the center of the room, eyes wide, breath shallow. She didn't move. She didn't scream. She simply watched her house weep. The air was warmer than usual, sweet and suffocating. She reached out and touched one of the wax streams. It stuck to her finger like honey, but colder, unnatural. And beneath her skin, a chill spread, not of fear, of recognition. Because she had smelled this wax before, years ago, when her grandmother passed. The scent had seeped into the village temple, where all the mourning jars were temporarily held before burial. The villagers said the scent came from sealed pain. She backed away from the wall. Behind her, the shelf creaked. She turned slowly. The jar had cracked. Not broken, not shattered, but a thin fracture now split the curve near its base, like a single vein crawling across skin. From the fracture, a drop of wax oozed, golden, slow, and sticky with memory. Yara stared at it in horror. She had never whispered into the jar. She had never sealed it. So what was leaking? Outside, the villagers had grown quiet. No one came near her home anymore. Children no longer played in the alleyway. Her neighbors no longer offered bread or dates in passing. She had become a boundary, a warning, a house with a name no one said aloud. That night, the wax spread faster. It dripped from the ceiling beams. It curled along the cracks in the floor. It clung to her shoes, her clothes, her bed. She dreamed of her father again. But this time, he wasn't silent. He was buried in sand up to his neck, his mouth sealed shut with wax. His eyes were open, wide, desperate, pleading. He was trying to speak through it. The wax cracked at his lips, and as he forced a breath out, the sound that escaped wasn't words, it was her name. Yara awoke drenched in sweat, heart racing. She looked at the walls. They weren't just sweating wax anymore. They were weeping. And for the first time, she understood. Her house had become the jar. In Al-Qamar, grief must be whispered and buried. If not, it finds a way to rise, one crack at a time. The old woman arrived without sound. No knock, no footsteps, just the soft scrape of her wooden cane against the waxed floor. Yara found her standing just inside the doorway, half shadow, half memory. Old Ukba, the village grief-keeper, the last woman alive who still knew the full rites of sealing sorrow. Her face was a cracked map of sun and time. Her eyes, clouded by cataracts, held no light, but her ears had always been sharp, sharp enough to hear a sob not spoken, sharp enough to hear what lived beneath a floor. "I smelled the wax," she said. Her voice rasped like dry reeds brushing stone. "From halfway across the village. It's begun, hasn't it?" Yara stood frozen. "I didn't call for you," she whispered. "No," Ukba replied, "but the dead did." She stepped deeper into the house, her cane sticking faintly in the softening wax that coated the ground. "You didn't whisper," Ukba murmured, fingers trailing along the wall. "And now your house is doing it for you." Yara looked away, ashamed and furious. "I didn't want to say goodbye." "I know," Ukba nodded. "That's why you must." Yara's voice rose. "Why does everyone act like silence is sacred here, like pain can be locked away and buried forever? My father died in a storm. I didn't even see his face. I didn't get to touch his hands. And now I'm supposed to whisper my grief into a pot like it's a sin to feel it out loud?" Ukba turned slowly toward her. "It is not a sin to feel. It is a danger to let it fester." She moved toward the shelf, ran her wrinkled fingers over the cracked jar, then whispered more to the jar than to Yara, "Unspoken grief grows restless." She turned back to Yara, voice low. "Do you know why we seal it in clay and wax? Because sorrow has a shape, and once shaped, it can be buried. But if left shapeless, it spreads." She tapped her cane twice. "The old ones used to say, 'Grief left unburied grows teeth,' and you are starting to hear them gnaw." Yara's throat tightened. "What do I do now?" Ukba's eyes, clouded but sure, turned toward the floor. "You must finish the ritual. Whisper what you would not say. Seal what you tried to escape. Or else you won't be the one haunting this place. You'll be the one buried inside it, alive." As quickly as she came, she turned and left, her cane clicking softly through the wax trail behind her. The door swung shut in silence, and Yara was alone again. With a jar cracked open, with a house still breathing, and a name that echoed louder each night. Some doors in the spirit world are not opened by rituals, but by refusal, and once open, they do not close without a cost. That night, Yara didn't light a lantern. She didn't sweep the wax from the corners. She didn't try to sleep. She simply lay on the floor, arms across her chest, body still, listening. The house exhaled around her. The walls no longer creaked, they sighed. And somewhere beneath her back, something shifted, slow, careful, like a body adjusting in its grave. She must have drifted at some point, because when the dream came, it arrived without warning, like smoke through a keyhole. In it, Yara stood in a desert of wax, not sand. The dunes shimmered golden beneath a black sky. The moon was missing. The stars pulsed like open wounds. And everywhere, the air smelled of honey and rot. Before her, a single palm tree stood. Its trunk was burned black. Its fronds were wilted and dripping, not with water, but with melted wax. Beneath it knelt her father. His back was to her, his body half buried in the wax dune. And from the nape of his neck, something unnatural grew. A wick, a burning wick. Smoke spiraled from it in slow, rhythmic curls. He was a candle, a man burning down from grief that never found a jar. "Baba!" she whispered. He turned, but his face was sealed. Not covered, not hidden, sealed. Wax covered his mouth, his nose, even his eyes, but he still wept. The wax cracked with each silent sob, forming fissures across his face. His hands trembled, reaching toward her, offering a small, unfinished jar, the same one she had refused to fill. And then he began to sink, slowly at first, then faster. The wax beneath him bubbled, pulling him downward as if it were alive, hungry. Yara screamed, tried to move, but her legs were buried, her arms too. Only her mouth remained above the surface. She tried to scream his name, but her lips filled with wax, warm, sweet, suffocating. She jolted awake, gasping, coughing, hands clawing at her throat. But the wax wasn't in her mouth. It was on her pillow. A single, perfect bead of wax had fallen during the night, right above her head. And beneath her pillow, the mourning jar. She hadn't placed it there. She rose slowly, hands trembling. The room was cold. The wax trails on the walls had hardened overnight, forming patterns, swirls, spirals. And at the center of each spiral, her name. Not in letters, but in motion, in movement. The house had started calling her, not out of malice, out of need. Grief denied becomes grief distorted. It doesn't want to haunt you. It wants to be held. And if you won't hold it, your house will. The next night, the floor didn't just breathe. It spoke. It began with the sound of shifting earth. Not loud, not violent, just the soft, unsettling rustle of something moving in dry sand, like fingers combing through burial dust. Yara sat rigid on her sleeping mat, the jar cradled in her lap like a sick child. She hadn't lit a fire. She hadn't eaten. The silence in the house was thick as smoke. Then came the whisper. Not from the jar, from beneath the floorboards. At first she couldn't make out words, only cadence, the gentle rise and fall of something trying, struggling to form a voice. Then, Yara, her name, drawn out like a sigh, drawn upward from the earth. Her blood ran cold. She stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the center of the room where the wax had pooled deepest. "Who's there?" she asked. But she already knew. The voice returned, more confident now, more human. "Yara, it's cold down here." She staggered backward, knocking over a bowl of water. "No," she whispered, "you're not real. You're not him." "I waited for you." The voice broke on the last word, like a sob caught between ribs. "I waited, but you never came." Yara fell to her knees, pressing her hands against the wax-slicked wood. "Stop," she said. "Stop talking like that. You're not him. He's gone. He's not buried." The voice was clear now, calm. "Not sealed, not named. You left me with no words." She began to cry. Not loudly, not the wailing kind, just the soft, silent tears of someone who has run out of ways to be angry and is left only with ache. "I didn't know how,"
she whispered to the floor. "I didn't know what to say." "You didn't need perfect words, only true ones." A sudden crack echoed through the room. Yara leapt to her feet. One of the floorboards had split. From the gap rose a thin stream of wax-scented smoke, curling upward like a question mark. And beneath the broken board, a jar, old, dust-covered, different from hers. Its wax seal was broken. Yara reached down, trembling, and lifted it carefully. It was warm to the touch. Inside, something faintly rattled. When she opened the lid, a whisper escaped. Not a word, but a feeling. Longing, regret, grief that had fermented for decades in silence. She dropped the jar. It didn't break, but for a moment she thought she might. The house fell still again. The voice beneath the floor retreated. Not gone, just waiting. Waiting for her to speak, to fill what she had left empty. Some spirits scream, others whisper, but the cruelest ones are the ones who wait for us to finally listen.
By morning, the wind had died, but the sand had not. It crept, not outside, inside, through the cracks beneath the door, between the gaps in the walls, through slits too small for breath. Yara woke to find her floor dusted with a fine layer of desert sand. Not enough to bury, just enough to warn. She stepped barefoot across it. It shifted like skin, soft, dry, but alive. In the corner of the room, her mourning jar had tipped over in the night, unbroken, unfilled, still waiting. But next to it, half buried in the sand, was something new. A second jar, older, its surface etched with lines like ribs, the wax seal gone, its mouth cracked open. And when she leaned in, just slightly, she heard it. Not a voice, not a breath, a murmur. Dozens of them, layered, ancient, unfinished. She snatched her hand back. Her fingers tingled as if the jar had tried to pull her in. She turned to the window and saw the courtyard beyond her home. And for the first time in days, she left the house. The village looked afraid. Doors were closed, curtains drawn. The smell of wax lingered in the air like an omen. She passed by the bakery, no smoke from the oven. Passed by the well, no voices, no buckets drawn. And then she heard them, whispers, faint, underfoot, beneath the sand. She knelt, pressing her palm to the ground. The grains were warm and moving, as if something just beneath the surface was speaking to each other, not in words, but in sounds only grief would recognize. 100 sorrows, 1,000 unspoken goodbyes, buried, but not silent. Yara stumbled backward, heart racing. That's when she saw the girl, a child, maybe 6 years old, standing beside the mosque wall, barefoot in the sand. In her tiny hands, she held a cracked jar. Wax dripped from its sides. The girl looked at Yara, not with fear, but with tired, knowing eyes. She opened the jar slowly. A sigh escaped. Then the girl turned and, without a word, walked toward the desert, alone. Yara watched until the child disappeared beyond the dunes, and then she looked at her own hands.
They were coated in fine sand, and between her fingers, wax bees, soft, warm, waiting. In Al-Kamar, grief does not die. It is passed, hand to hand, breath to breath, jar to jar. And the sand remembers everything we bury too shallow.
She had to see it for herself. The next night, Yara waited until the house fell silent again. Not just quiet, but breathless, like it was holding something in. Then she lit a single oil lamp and placed it on the ground, casting long, flickering shadows against the wall stained with wax. She knelt beside the cracked floorboard and began to dig. The wax resisted her. It clung to her fingers, thick and reluctant, like a substance that had memory. But she pushed through it, peeling back the congealed layers, prying the wood loose until the board groaned and gave way. Beneath it, darkness, and then clay. Not one jar, not two, dozens. They were packed into the earth like bones, some stacked on top of each other, some sunken sideways, half swallowed by dirt. And many of them, too many, were broken, their wax seals shattered, their rims chipped. The soft, scorched scent of ancient sorrow rose up from the crawl space like incense gone bitter. Yara's breath caught in her throat. This was not just her grief. This was legacy. She reached down, fingertips grazing one of the fractured jars. It whispered, not a name, not a language, a sound, like breath drawn between clenched teeth, pain without shape, a sigh that had waited a century to be heard. And then, another whisper, and another, until all around her the jars began to hum, each one with its own melody of mourning, a chorus of unfinished farewells. Suddenly, one of the broken jars cracked deeper, releasing a puff of dust and wax. A voice rose from it, rough, weathered, male. "Don't forget me!" Yara stumbled back, heart pounding. Another jar followed, a woman's voice this time. "I died with your name on my lips." A third. "I couldn't scream, so I whispered, and no one came." She fell to her knees, covering her ears. But the voices didn't stop. They weren't angry. They were desperate, soft, starved, trapped. And as Yara sat in the center of her crumbling floorboard, surrounded by the ancient grief of her bloodline, she realized the truth. These weren't strangers. They were her family. The unburied sorrow of mothers who never wept, fathers who swallowed fear, children who died unnamed. Each voice a grief that someone hadn't had the courage to whisper. She looked toward her own jar on the shelf, still intact, still waiting. And for the first time, she felt its weight, not in her hands, but in her chest. Some inherit land, others debt. But in Al-Kamar, the greatest inheritance is silence, and Yara was no longer willing to pass it on. Yara went to her before dawn. The village was still asleep, though asleep had become a generous word in recent days. Most homes now stayed dark through the night, curtains drawn tight, as if every family could hear something stirring beneath their floors. Yara walked barefoot across the sand. It felt warmer than it should have, almost pulsing. She followed the smell of wax and herbs until she reached the edge of the village, where the old grief keeper lived in a round clay hut
carved into the hillside. Ukba was already awake. The old woman was grinding black seeds into ash when Yara entered. "I wondered when you'd come," Ukba rasped, not looking up. "I saw the jars under my floor. They were my family's, weren't they?" Ukba nodded. "They belonged to all those who lived in that house before you, and to those who never had the chance to whisper their sorrow. They were broken. Their grief escaped." Ukba placed the pestle down. "No, child, it was never sealed. Your family, like many in this village, honored the silence, but feared the whisper. They performed the ritual with their hands, not with their hearts." She turned toward Yara then, her cataract eyes cloudy but knowing. "Grief unspoken does not die. It sleeps, and then it greeds." Yara sat down on the floor. "I need to know everything," she said. "Why do we do this? The jars, the wax, the whispering. Why must sorrow be sealed?" Ukba was quiet for a moment. Then she began. "A long time ago, this village was not silent. It was full of weeping. Death was constant, droughts, fevers, stillbirths. The people mourned openly, loudly. Every morning the desert echoed with wails. But the grief, it multiplied. It soaked into the land, into the clay, into the air. People began to see things, hear voices. The dead walked in dreams and sometimes in daylight, not with vengeance, but with ache, with unfinished longing. The elders feared the grief had become a spirit of its own, a thing that fed on sorrow left hanging. So they created the ritual: clay to hold the grief, wax to silence it, earth to bury it, and whisper to release it gently. Yara whispered, "And if we don't whisper?" Ukba's jaw tightened. "Then grief lingers. It presses against the skin of the world, and if it presses long enough, it tears through." Yara was silent, then asked the question that had burned in her since the storm. "Have you ever broken the ritual?" The room grew still. Ukba's fingers curled over her knees. "I did," she said, softly. "Once. My son." Her voice cracked on the word. "He drowned during the floods. I wasn't there. I didn't know until days after they pulled his body from the reeds. When they brought him to me, the jar was already prepared, the wax warm, the village waiting. But I couldn't speak, not one word. I tried, but everything I wanted to say felt too small. So I stayed silent. I buried the jar empty." Yara reached out, her hand trembling. "What happened?" Ukba's eyes welled, though no tears fell. "My house wept for years. I had to move. Sometimes," she added, her voice nearly a whisper, "I still hear him when the wind is right, when I'm grinding herbs, when the clay is warm in my hands. He says nothing. He just breathes." The two women sat in the silence between generations. Then Ukba spoke again. "You have a choice, child. You can break the chain, or you can continue it. But understand this: unburied grief does not stay quiet forever. It only waits for someone weaker than you to carry it. In Al-Kamar, stories don't die. They're sealed in jars, buried in earth, and passed down through silence until someone dares to whisper them back into light."
That night, Yara didn't sleep. She didn't lie down. She didn't light a lamp. She simply sat on the cracked floor of her home, surrounded by old jars and broken silence, waiting. For what? She didn't know. Until it spoke again. But this time, it wasn't her name it called. It was her mother's. Layla. The voice rose from beneath the floor like smoke rising through the seams of the earth. Soft, tender, terrifying. Yara's body went cold. Her mother had died when she was a baby, taken by the fever that swept through the village during the season of rot. She had no memory of her, no image beyond a faded cloth-wrapped portrait that used to hang above her father's bed. No one spoke of her mother, not even him. But the floor remembered. Layla, the voice sighed again. I kept it all. I kept it all for you. Yara knelt beside the largest crack in the floor, her hands trembling as she pressed her ear against the wax-coated wood. There it was again, a whisper not meant for her, a conversation buried, a grief that had never been exchanged. Why did you leave me? The voice asked, broken with ache. Why did you take the words and go? Yara's lips parted, heart thudding. That wasn't her father's voice. It was someone else. She rose slowly and made her way to the far end of the house, where the wall curved inwards and the oldest wax stains clung like vines. She began to dig, not with tools, with her hands. The earth was dry but soft, crumbling under her nails, and buried less than a foot down, where the wall met the foundation, she found it. A jar, small, delicate, unmarked, and sealed in red wax, not yellow. She'd never seen red wax used before. It glistened under the moonlight like blood that refused to dry. She lifted it, held it close, and it pulsed. Warm, alive, waiting. She pressed it to her ear, and the voice whispered again, but this time it knew her. Yara. It was barely a breath, but the tone, maternal. And suddenly, her knees gave out. She crumpled to the floor, jar in hand, and wept, not for her father, not for the ghosts in the walls, but for the mother she never got to grieve. Images came, not memories, but impressions, a lullaby without melody, hands brushing hair aside, the scent of rose water and sweat, a name spoken with reverence and longing. She didn't know how the jar remembered, but it did. And now it offered it back, not to haunt her, to return her, to the grief she was too young to carry and too old now to ignore. That night, she did something she had never done. She whispered into the jar, but not words, a sob, raw, cracked, wordless. She pressed her lips to the rim and let the sound fall in, and the jar closed itself. The wax warmed, softened, and sealed shut on its own. No knife, no flame, no ritual. Just a breath, finally spoken. Some jars aren't meant to be filled with words. Some are meant to catch the ache we inherited from people we never met, but still mourn. The sealed jar sat on her lap, warm and still. Yara didn't move for a long time. She stared at it in the dim light of early dawn, half expecting the wax to melt again, for the voice to return, for the ache to begin all over. But the jar stayed silent, not because it was empty, but because it was heard. She thought it would feel like relief. It didn't. It felt like opening a door to a hallway full of locked rooms, each one holding another sorrow, another silence passed down to her through blood and fear. She looked around at the broken floor, at the dozens of old mourning jars she had uncovered. Cracked, dusty, breathing. None of them had been sealed. None of them had been finished. That evening, she brought them out one by one, lined them along the walls of her home, gently wiping away the dirt with an old cloth. Each jar whispered something different, not in full voices, but in emotional fragments. Shame, loneliness, helplessness, anger that had never been named. She sat before them, cross-legged in the center of her grief, and she began to speak, not perfectly, not clearly, sometimes in broken phrases, sometimes in nothing but breath. To one jar she whispered, "I forgive you." To another, "You didn't deserve it." To a third, "You were only a child." Some jars responded, some didn't, but one by one she let them witness her voice. And something in the house changed. The walls stopped weeping, the wax stopped moving, the floor stilled, not dead, just listening. Hours passed, then days, and every night she returned to the jars, adding her voice where others had gone silent, stitching together a family of grief that had never been allowed to speak. But when she came to her father's jar, the original one, still unsealed, still empty, she froze. It was heavier now, as if the silence inside had turned to stone. She lifted it gently, placed it before her, and stared. Her hands trembled, because this grief wasn't inherited. It was hers. She tried once. Her voice caught in her throat. Tried again. Nothing. The words she needed didn't exist in any language, only in ache. She pressed the jar to her chest and closed her eyes. And in that darkness, she whispered not to the jar, but to him. "I hated you for leaving. I hated that you loved me quietly. I hated that you died without teaching me how to say goodbye. But I miss you. I miss you. I miss you. I miss you." She pressed the rim of the jar to her lips and sobbed. The wax seal had been beside her for days, softened by the desert heat, waiting. She dipped her finger into the golden pool and sealed the jar. It glowed faintly for a moment, then cooled. Still, whole, finished. Some grief is ancient, some is ours, but none of it is meant to stay in the throat. It must be whispered, or it will wait forever to be heard. It happened just after she sealed her father's jar. Yara stood slowly, hands still sticky with wax, chest hollowed out by everything she'd released. The house felt calmer. The silence wasn't thick anymore. It was breathable, even gentler. But as she turned to place the sealed jar beside the others, she noticed something. The wax on her fingertips was no longer golden. It was red. She blinked, heart skipping. Not the deep, deliberate crimson of ceremonial wax, but blood. Not thick, not gushing, just a smear across her fingers, a small cut on the tip of her thumb she hadn't noticed, from digging, from scraping, from bearing. She moved toward the lamp and held her hand to the light. The blood mixed into the cooling wax, curling into it like a thread of memory. And when she turned back to the jar, it was pulsing. Not violently, not threateningly, but like something alive inside had stirred. The seal held firm, but the jar radiated heat, not warmth. Grief reborn, grief made aware. She backed away slowly. Then the floor trembled, not across the whole house, just beneath her feet. She knelt down, palms to the wood, and felt it, a heartbeat. Slow, steady, familiar. It matched the rhythm of the jar. It matched the rhythm of her own chest. And then a voice, not from the floor, not from below, but from within her. You sealed it with your blood. It was her father's voice, but not external, not ghostly. It was buried in her memory, drawn out like smoke from an ember she hadn't known still burned. And with it came images, her father's hands, his quiet gaze, the soft humming he used to do when he repaired the roof or shelled nuts for winter. Small things, things she had buried, not in a jar, but in herself. She clutched the sealed vessel to her chest and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." But even as the words left her lips, the air shifted, because the house was. From the walls came a crack, just one, but it echoed like a scream behind stone. A fissure split down the far corner, and from it oozed not wax, but dark red sap, thicker than wax, slower than blood, something older. It trailed along the wall like a curse waking from sleep, and behind it, a whisper, not of sorrow, but of hunger. The old jars along the wall trembled. The sealed ones stayed quiet, but the broken ones began to hum, low, in unison, like a choir beneath the earth preparing to sing. And Yara understood. She had stirred something deeper, something beneath the grief. Not all silence holds sorrow. Some silence was placed there to bury what sorrow tried to protect us from. And once disturbed, it does not forgive. By morning, the room had changed. It still had 4 walls, a ceiling, a floor. But it was no longer the room Yara had grown up in. The hearth, once the heart of their home, was coated in dried wax. The shelves where herbs and lentils used to rest were bare, and the clay walls no longer responded to light, they absorbed it. But what unsettled her most was that this room no longer had a name. Every home in Al-Kamar had a name passed down through generations, a name whispered into the first jar sealed in its walls. Her childhood room had once been called Qalb Layla, Layla's heart, named after her mother. Everyone knew that. Even the beeswax seals remembered. But now, the name was gone. Spoken aloud, it vanished before it reached the walls. Carved into the wood, it faded before her eyes. Even Uqba, when she came at sunset to check on Yara, hesitated in the doorway. "This room," she whispered, "has unclaimed grief." "Unclaimed?" Yara asked, her voice hoarse. Uqba nodded slowly. "There are sorrows we inherit, sorrows we seal, sorrows we forget." She paused, eyes narrowing at the walls that pulsed faintly with red veins of dried sap. "But this is a sorrow that was refused, one that built itself a home while everyone looked away." Yara led her to the far corner, where the wall had cracked, where the dark sap still oozed in thin rivulets, where whispers had begun to curl in the air like incense smoke. They listened together, not to words, but to feeling. It wasn't grief anymore.
It was something underneath it, older, hungrier, rooted in generations of silence. Ukba whispered, "It's no longer asking to be heard, it's asking to be fed." Yara's skin crawled. Fed with what? The old woman didn't answer. Instead, she moved to one of the older broken jars, held it close to her ear, and her body went stiff. She dropped it with a gasp. Her eyes, wide with horror, turned to Yara. "That jar," she stammered, "that belonged to your great-grandmother's sister. She died before the ritual was ever taught, before the first wax seals, before the silence. She was buried beneath this room." Yara stepped back, dizzy. "This house is built on her?" "No," said Ukba. "This room is her." The walls moaned, not from pain, but from recognition. They were being named, and Yara suddenly understood. This wasn't a room that forgot its name. It had been waiting for someone to remember it, to call it by the sorrow it was built upon. She knelt beside the bleeding crack and whispered, "I know you now." The pulse in the walls slowed, the sap ceased to drip, and in the silence that followed, a breath rose from the floorboards. Not angry, not grieving, but finally, still. Some rooms are not built for the living. They are memories wearing walls. And when the memory is remembered, the house can finally rest.
The silence held. For the first time in weeks, the house no longer groaned. No wax dripped from the beams. No whispers curled beneath the floor. But Yara didn't feel peace. She felt anticipation, as if the house had taken one long breath and was waiting to see what she would do with it. She returned to Ukba the next morning, pale from sleeplessness. "I've sealed my grief," she said. "I've buried it with my breath, but the house, it still watches me." Ukba stirred something thick and bitter-smelling over her hearth, nodding. "Because there's one ritual you haven't done." Yara frowned. "What haven't I done?" The old woman turned toward her slowly. "You've never mourned in reverse." "In reverse?" Yara echoed. "The ritual we teach, the jar, the whisper, the seal, it's for the living," Ukba said. "But there is another, an older one, before wax, before jars." She lowered her voice, as if the house itself might hear. "The inverted mourning." Ukba explained. "There were once too many deaths to grieve in order, too many names, too many voices. And so, in desperate times, when sorrow overwhelmed the village, they mourned backward, not by speaking to the dead, but by listening to them, letting the sorrow speak first. It is dangerous," Ukba warned. "You must give the house permission, not just to echo grief, but to show you the memory it holds." Yara's throat tightened. "And if I refuse?" Ukba looked her in the eyes. "Then the grief will find another vessel, another body, another mouth." That night, Yara prepared. She cleared the floor, gathered the sealed jars in a circle, placed the broken ones beyond them, outside the threshold of wax and earth. She sat in the center, alone, and whispered, "I'm ready to hear you." The temperature dropped instantly. The air inside the house turned to ash and wind. The lamp flickered and died, and from beneath the floor, a voice. But not a whisper, not a breath, a memory. She wasn't in her home anymore.
She was standing barefoot in a room built centuries ago. The walls were the same shape. The earth smelled familiar. But the woman before her, tall, veiled in black, hands stained with red wax, was not her. Not exactly. She was older, fiercer, and silent. Surrounding the woman in black were mourners with broken mouths. Literally, their lips had been sealed shut with wax. Their eyes cried, but their tongues were bound. And the woman in black was collecting their sorrow without words, holding out her hands, letting grief bleed through the skin and into a single jar. It was the first mourning jar, not made with clay, made with flesh. And Yara watched in horror as the woman carved a symbol into her own chest and poured the sorrow into herself. The seal wasn't beeswax, it was a scar. Yara screamed, and the memory shattered. She collapsed back into her home, gasping. The house was still, but something was different. The walls no longer pulse with breath. The sap had dried, and on the floor before her was a new jar, smooth, pale, unmarked. But when she lifted it, her reflection stared back, not from the outside, from within. The oldest grief does not ask to be sealed. It asks to be witnessed. And once it speaks, it must find a home.
The new jar sat silently in her hands, lighter than it should have been, but heavy in presence. It bore no seal, no name, no whisper, only a hollow stillness that seemed to listen back. Yara turned it slowly, tracing her fingertips over its surface. It was impossibly smooth, too perfect, too untouched, like it had never been made, only remembered. She held it to her ear. No voice, no hum. But beneath the silence, something pulsed, a presence. She placed it on the floor among the others. But none of the other jars acknowledged it. Not the sealed ones, not even the broken ones. It was as if this jar didn't belong, or worse, refused to. That night, the dream returned. But this time there was no desert, no palm tree, no wax, only darkness. And in that darkness, a figure sat across from her, shrouded in shadow, faceless, but aware. She tried to speak, but her mouth wouldn't open, tried to move, but her limbs were weightless. Then the figure leaned forward, and in a voice made of everyone she had never mourned, it asked, "What name will you give me?" Yara jolted awake, covered in sweat, throat raw, the echo of the question still ringing. She sat upright and looked across the room. The jar was gone. She searched the house, every corner, every crevice. Nothing. Then she heard it, breathing, not from beneath the floor, not from the walls, from inside the hearth. She approached slowly, heart pounding. There in the ashes, the nameless jar, half buried, waiting. She reached for it, but the air around it turned ice cold. Her hand froze mid-motion as the hearth whispered, "You cannot name what was never mourned." And then a second voice,
a child's voice, faint, shivering. "I was never given a jar." The voice was not familiar, not kin, not ancestor. It was older than that. It belonged to someone who had died long before the ritual ever existed. Someone whose grief had never been shaped, sealed, or buried. A sorrow too ancient for memory. A sorrow that had slipped through generations, unclaimed. Yara knelt slowly. "I don't know your name, but I will listen." The fire pit flickered to life, no flame, only light. And in that soft glow, images danced in the soot. A child dying in silence, a mother too numb to cry, a village that moved on too quickly, a name never spoken aloud. Yara began to hum. No words, just a melody, a lullaby she didn't know she knew. And the jar pulsed once, then stopped. Still, silent, but not empty. When she reached to lift it again, it allowed her. And now, carved faintly into its side, was a single word: unknown. Written in the old script, not forgotten, not erased, witnessed. There are sorrows older than memory, suffering so deep they fall through history like cracks in the earth. But even nameless grief deserves a place to rest. The next day, the villagers began to gather. Not because they were summoned, not because they understood, but because they felt it. A shift in the air, a tremble in the sand, a silence that no longer wanted to be hidden, but shared. They came slowly, elders leaning on carved sticks, children holding tightly to mothers' robes, eyes hollow with old grief, tongues scarred with too many years of swallowing pain. They stood outside Yara's home, unsure why they had come, and she stepped forward to tell them. "There is a voice beneath this village," Yara said, "but it is not angry. It is starving." She held up the nameless jar. "They are not curses, not ghosts, not punishments. They are our own pain, the kind we passed down, the kind we buried without breath." She turned slowly, facing every soul gathered in the square. "You don't need to be strong anymore. You don't need to be quiet. You don't need to pretend you forgot who you lost." Ukba emerged from the crowd, silently, solemnly, and knelt in the sand. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in decades, she let out a sound that had no shape, a crack in her voice, a split in her silence, a fragment of a scream buried in her spine. And then she whispered a name, one she had never dared to speak aloud: her sons. One by one, others followed, men who had lost brothers, women who had buried children, young girls who had never known their mothers. They didn't shout, they didn't cry, they whispered. Each whisper poured into a jar, each jar sealed with beeswax, each name given to the earth, not to forget, but to remember the right way. And Yara did not whisper. She watched, because this time she was the vessel, the one who remembered the forgotten, who mourned backward, who made space for sorrow too old to name. At dusk, they lit a circle of oil lamps around the jars. No priest, no scripture, only silence, but a holy kind. And then came the final part of the ritual. Yara stepped forward, holding the nameless jar, her voice steady, her spine tall. We name you not because we know you, but because we refuse to leave you unknown. She kissed the rim of the jar, sealed it with wax from her own hands, and whispered not a name, but a vow. You will be forgotten no more. And then she buried the jar beneath the old fig tree at the edge of the village, where roots could hold it, where rain could reach it, where memory could rest. And so the ceremony of cracked tongues was born, not from tradition, but from defiance, a refusal to let pain become inheritance ever again.
That night, Yara returned to her home. Alone, but no longer lonely. The air inside was different now. Still dry, still warm, but not oppressive. It no longer pressed against her chest, it exhaled. She ran her fingers along the walls where wax had once bled. Now the surfaces were smooth, faded, soft, as if the house itself had shed its skin. She walked the perimeter of the room, touching every sealed jar. Each one now held a memory no longer fermenting in the dark. She paused before the hearth, the place where grief once pulsed, and in the ash she found no jar, only a small flower growing from the soot. White, delicate, impossible. She knelt before it in silence and wept. She didn't need to say anything. The house understood. Because the house had also mourned for decades, for generations, until tonight. Yara unrolled her mat on the floor and lay down. For the first time in weeks, no breath beneath her, no groaning wood, no murmurs in the sand, only her own heartbeat and the soft rustling of fig leaves outside the window. She slept, deeply, dreamlessly. And in that sleep, the house finally rested with her. Far below, buried beneath stone and jar, sealed names and unsealed wounds, the earth whispered, "Thank you," and then fell quiet. Some houses were never meant to be haunted. They were only waiting to be heard. And once heard, they can finally sleep. It began with laughter, soft, high-pitched, not ghostly, human. Yara heard it just before dawn as she watered the fig tree where the nameless jar had been buried. The morning was cool, the air still sweet from last night's rain, and for the first time in weeks, the village felt light. The sound came again. She turned and saw the child. The same girl she had once glimpsed weeks ago, the one with the cracked jar in her hands. But this time, she brought nothing. No jar, no wax, no sorrow. Only a small white flower tucked behind her ear, the same kind now growing in Yara's hearth. She stood barefoot in the sand, smiling faintly, watching Yara with old, unblinking eyes. Yara approached slowly. "Are you lost?" she asked gently. The girl tilted her head. "No," she replied. "I've been here." Her voice was strange, young in sound, ancient in presence. Yara's skin prickled. "What's your name?" she asked. The girl shrugged. "They never gave me one." Yara crouched beside her, heartbeat steady. "But you're not angry?" The girl shook her head. "I was, for a long time, but someone heard me." She stepped closer and gently touched Yara's hand. "You gave me silence that wasn't empty." They stood like that for a while, woman and child, grief keeper and ghost, past and present. And then the girl looked toward the village square. "They're waiting for you." Yara turned to look. A group of children sat beneath the fig tree, drawing symbols in the dirt, humming the lullaby she once sang to the nameless jar. Yara turned back. The girl was gone. No footprints, no whisper, only a small jar resting in the sand where she'd stood, unsealed, empty, but inside, a flower, fresh, alive. Yara lifted it gently and smiled. No grief, no pain, just a promise. Not all jars must hold sorrow. Some are meant to carry what remains when sorrow ends, and sometimes the child returns not for rest, but for rebirth. Yara stood in the center of her home, the soft light of morning spilling through the windows like grace. Around her, the jars no longer hummed, they rested, not as burdens, but as witnesses. Each one held not just grief, but honor. Each name sealed within was now remembered, not repressed. Each whisper had become a prayer. She placed the final jar, the one with the flower, at the center of the room, unsealed, empty, and yet full of something unspeakable. Not sorrow, not silence, but continuation. She sat beside it, cross-legged on the cool floor, and reached for the small bowl of wax warming near the hearth. Then paused, because this time she wouldn't seal it. Not with wax, not with blood, not with fear. Instead, she whispered, "This jar will remain open, for the ones still searching for words, for the sorrows unborn, for the memories not yet ready to speak." And as her voice faded, the wind stirred gently through the window, lifting the edges of her shawl like a quiet nod from something older than time. The villagers came one by one that afternoon, not for a funeral, not for a ritual, for a gathering. Children carried empty jars. Mothers carried names they'd never spoken aloud. Fathers came with trembling hands and voices they hadn't used in years. They didn't weep. They whispered. They sat. They listened. And the house, Yara's house, listened back. By dusk, the fig tree bloomed again, its roots deep in sorrow, its branches lifted in memory. And at its base sat the very first unsealed jar, not as a warning, as a welcome. Yara stepped back inside, her heart no longer hollow. She placed her hand on the wall. It was warm, alive, but no longer restless. For the first time in generations, the house had nothing left to say. That night, she dreamed of her father, not weeping, not buried, but laughing, seated beneath the tree, teaching the nameless child how to whistle with 2 fingers. When he turned to Yara, he said, "Thank you for finishing what we were too afraid to begin." She woke with tears on her cheeks, not heavy, not bitter, just enough to feel human again. The mourning jar was no longer an object. It was a legacy,
a symbol, a choice, to feel, to speak, to name what aches, so that no grief, old, silent, or small, would ever again be left to grow teeth in the dark. And in a village once haunted by silence, the loudest sound you could now hear was peace.